So we're now going to be looking at rhombuses and squares. So if we look at our flow chart, a rhombus comes from a parallelogram, and a square is a combination between a rectangle and a rhombus. So there's some combined properties that get us to a square, but then we also have to account for the fact that a rhombus comes from a parallelogram. So there's some properties we need to discuss. So like I just said, a rhombus comes from a parallelogram, and again, we can look at that flow chart. So that means a rhombus will have the following properties. It contains all the properties of a parallelogram, just like the rectangle did, okay? So does a rhombus come from a rectangle? No. We see that on that flow chart up here that it does not come from the rectangle, okay? So there is something that distinguishes a difference. So here's our rhombus here. For a rhombus, all four sides are going to be congruent. This is what makes it different than the rectangle. The diagonals will bisect the angles they intersect. So this is congruent to this to this, these congruent to these, and these congruent to these. So that's an additional property we have not seen yet. They bisect the angles. And then also where the diagonals meet, they create right angles, or they are also perpendicular. So four right triangles make up a rhombus. So the additional properties would be that there's four congruent sides, the diagonals bisect the angles, and the diagonals are also perpendicular when they intersect. The same properties still follow. Again, it has all the properties from a parallelogram. So this is congruent to this. This diagonal piece is congruent to this diagonal piece. So don't forget about the things we've learned from the parallelogram. They still apply. So now, if we look down here, we're going to skip this section right here. There's a little bit, an excess of information. But let's now see how the square comes from both the rectangle and the rhombus. So again, if we look back at our flow chart, you can see here that a square is made up of both a rectangle and a rhombus. So it could get a little tricky here with knowing the properties. So in a square, what can we say? A square also has four congruent sides and four right angles. So let's label these here. Four right angles and four congruent sides. Now, the way we know this is a square instead of a rhombus is the fact that the diagonals are now congruent. And that comes from the rectangle. So again, a square is a combination between a rectangle and a rhombus. Now, from the rhombus, we had that these are perpendicular to each other. From the rectangle, we have the diagonals being congruent. And again, it has all the rhombus properties. So if this is 90 degrees, again, in a rhombus, the diagonals bisect the angles. So this would be 45 and this would be 45. Same goes for all of these here. So 45, 45, 45, 45, and 45. And then on the inside, we have 90-degree angles. So there are no additional properties for the square. The way we set a square apart from a rhombus or a rectangle is that it's all of those properties now combined. So there are no really additional things to combine for the square. So again, if we look at our flow chart, the parallelogram had those properties, the five we mentioned at the top. Then we had our separate properties for the rectangle. We had that the diagonals were congruent and four right angles. And then for the rhombus, we had that the diagonals bisect the angles and also they create right angles where they intersect. So now, to make the square, we are combining those properties. The diagonals are congruent and also create right angles and also bisect these angles here. So again, the square is a combination of properties between the rectangle and the rhombus.